Thank you.
So hi everyone, welcome to our Bats and Sacred Faces webinar. My name is Isis Figueiredo Proctor and I'm pleased to be chairing this event today. This session has been organised by the Bats and Churches project. For those who haven't heard of us yet, we are a unique collaboration that was created to address issues that bats can cause in churches in England whilst continuing to protect their roosts. So bats in churches is a long-standing issue in England and one that we believe can only be overcome by different sectors working together. There is the possibility for human-wildlife conflict when bats and people share the same spaces, and places of worship add an additional dimension, as they are precious and sacred to those using them, and of huge cultural importance. England is not alone, and bats can be found in places of worship around the globe. Today, we'll explore how the situation differs in different areas across the globe, how important these spaces are in the conservation of bats, and also how do bats and people live alongside each other. So today we have a great lineup of guests to talk about just this. Please do ask any questions in the chat and we'll try to get to as many as possible at the end. So before I hand over to our first speaker, I want to give a big thank you to the National Lottery Heritage Fund and those playing the lottery for making this project possible. Also, a big thank you to the British Ecological Society for funding a number of events and training sessions this year. So yeah, I would like to introduce our first panelist, Niels Bullard. Niels recently completed his Big Bat Year, which took him to all continents and to about 30 different countries in search of bats. He ended up seeing 400 species. Of those, he was able to make some sound recordings of over 250 species, some of them in remote areas and rarely recorded before. So over to you, Niels. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Isis. So hello, everyone. Well,
yeah, as Isis said, I've been asked to talk to you about some other bats I saw on the Big Bat Year. Now, as you said, I've seen 400 species. I've seen obviously millions of bats. So I had to obviously make choices. So this will just be a short presentation of some of the highlights of the bats I saw in, well, sacred places. Let me just figure out how this thing works. Okay, should be working now. So let's get right into it, because you've introduced the Big Bat Year, so I don't need to do that. And so no one had done a world tour to look for bats before, so I had to be fairly creative in how I would find as many bats as I could in 1 year. And it took me to some unexpected places, at least places I didn't expect as a European bat worker before that. A lot of those places were obviously caves. And in Asia, particularly, a number of those caves are used as temples. Instead of building something, they use what's already there and then just add whatever's necessary to make it a temple. And obviously, because it's a cave before being a temple, a lot of those temples have bats. And here are some examples. So this is a temple in Thailand. As you can see, it's obviously a temple. The bat that you see on the photo is obviously not a real one, but I did see real ones in there. I just, yeah, don't take pictures with the real one and the fake one together. First example is the black-bearded tomb bat. So it's called a tomb bat, but it uses a lot more than just tombs, obviously. It uses a lot of human-made structures, but also natural caves. And in this case, it was a natural cave that also served as temple. It's a species that, because of that, often lives alongside humans and seems to tolerate our presence fairly well. So it's a common sight in houses throughout Southeast and Southern Asia, as well as temples and caves and all that. Obviously, the main species I wanted to see in caves in Thailand was the infamous bumblebee bat, the one that's most often portrayed by inaccurate pictures on the internet. But this is a true picture of a true bumblebee bat. And so you have to know that in Thailand, the only legally protected bat species is the bumblebee bat. So even though they're present in a number of temples throughout Western Thailand, usually they are present, they're restricted to restricted areas of the temple where people are not allowed to go. So we had special permission to take some photos and to go see them in there. This is one such picture that was taken then. But it's a very special bat because it's present in very few places, and this legal protection is definitely helping. But it's still surprising to see it in fairly popular caves, because a lot of those temples in Thailand are obviously have become over the years touristic attractions. So it's quite nice to see that the species is still present in those caves. And then a surprise was this bat that I've forgotten the English name of. It's a trident bat. I can't remember which one. There's only one there. So and this was an unknown population before, because so when we got to a complex of caves, monks showed us around, and then at the end they told us, oh, by the way, we found a new cave. And so we went to visit that new cave they just found, and found these very rare bats in there, which was quite a surprise, but also a very welcome one. Now, traveling to the New World, there the temples are, well, as you can see, man-made, at least the ones that I'm showing now. So I'll be showing a few pictures of Mayan temples. Those are all from Mexico. And so if you look at everything the Mayans left us, there's a lot of bat illustrations and bat sculptures. So they definitely had ties to bats. It's obvious that they lived alongside each other. The one question that struck me when I saw these three-tailed bats in those, so they are present, you can see those door-looking things. They're present right above that. So quite low to the ground. Okay, so obvious to, at least to me, maybe not to most tourists who were visiting the temple. But they're from a family called Molosidae, and that family is not really illustrated by the Mayans. They mostly illustrated the Phallostomidae. So when I visited that temple, I couldn't stop wondering, when did those bats start using that temple? Because if they're not commonly illustrated by the Mayans, surely they can't have been present, or at least that conspicuous, when those temples were used. So I can't help but wonder, when did they start using it? Because Phallostomidae also used temples, and I've got an example coming up. And it's obvious that Mayans kept seeing those because they've kept sculpting them. I just wonder about this particular family. This particular family mostly roosts high up in trees because they struggle to take off when there's not enough ground clearance. Now, this particular temple helps because, as you can see, there's quite a slope between the top of that door and the grass. So they have enough height to take off, apparently. So here's a different temple, slightly poorer state of conservation. But it also had bats. In particular, it has this incredible species, that's Crotopterus auritus, one of the biggest bats in the Neotropics. It's considered a carnivorous bat, but it eats a lot of large insects, amphibians, other bats, a whole range of different animals. Now this picture, so I wanted to keep the disturbance of that individual to a minimum, so I took one picture and then just left. And then when reviewing the picture, I couldn't help but notice that there was something wrong with the number of ears of the pups. So you can see that now it seems obvious to me that there's 2 pups, but it's quite rare for that species and for Phallostomidae in general to have more than 1 pup. So it was quite an interesting sighting there, which meant that my picture wasn't completely unnecessary. And then when I went back to Europe, well, I had to visit some of our sacred places, and I had never done a church survey before, but I tried as much as possible during my world tour to tag along with existing surveys instead of having to cause additional disturbance to bats in order to see them. So in this case, I joined a group of Dutch bat workers who were already planning on doing counts in various churches in southern Holland, and just saw some bats that they would have been seen had I been there or not. So it was no additional disturbance for this a very cute little brown long-eared bat. And then, so obviously, as I said earlier, I saw a lot of bats in a lot of different places. So I had to make a selection. This is one I won't be covering at length, but I just want to include this picture because it includes a speaker we'll have later, Rajesh, there at the back, who found a Rhinolophus bidomei, I believe, in this newly built temple. So thank you very much. And if you're interested, there will be a book coming fairly soon, probably in about a year time, with those stories and a lot more stories, a lot more that I can fit into a 10-minute presentation. So thank you very much. I have no idea how I did with time, but yeah.
Thank you, Nils. That all sounds great. Really look forward to the book coming out. Just want to remind everyone, if you have any questions for Nils, please do put them on the chat, and we'll try to get to as many as possible at the end of the session. So now I would like to introduce you to the next panelist, Dr. Adria Lopez Borcels. Adria completed his PhD at the University of Lisbon in 2018. During his doctorate, he studied the effects of the Amazonian rainforest fragmentation on tropical bats using the autonomous ultrasound detectors. He has lately been focused on the soundscape exploration. in order to promote sustainable land use. His main area of interest has always been bat ecology and conservation worldwide, particularly in the most severely threatened species and habitats. So over to you, Andrea.
Okay, thank you very much, Isis. And thank you everyone for the invitation to be here and talking about bats in Madagascar. So let me share my screen first. Here it is. So can you see it, right? Yeah, can you see it? Yeah, okay. Okay, so hi everyone, good afternoon. I'm gonna talk about bats in sacred spaces, but in Madagascar. Okay, so when one thinks about sacred spaces, probably the first thing that comes to your mind is like these, large temples in Asia, in Mexico, these caves where some spiritual events take place. But this is not the same all over the world. And this is definitely not what happened in Madagascar. Okay, so Madagascar is very famous for its natural parks, its rainforest full of lemurs, these spectacular fauna, the baobabs, and all these amazing landscapes that you can see in all the advertisement. But the truth is that when you arrive to Madagascar, the first thing you see behind the baobabs is the rice crops. So almost all the landscape in Madagascar is covered by extensive and large rice paddies. And this has come to a very serious conservation consequences, because it's inevitable that the more agriculture you have, the more deforestation you have. And the truth is that rainforest in Madagascar has been decreasing dramatically during the last decades. As you can see in these pictures, like the rainforest, the native forest that we had in the East Coast, mainly in the Southwest, it's been decreasing substantially from the 50s to nowadays. So in few decades, we've lost more than 70–80% of rainforest coverage. And this is a huge concern for conservation, not only for bats, but for many other species and habitats. And you would be thinking, okay, why Adri is just talking about forest if this talk speaks about sacred spaces? The reason is because this is the reason why we went in first place to Madagascar. As some of you know, we had this project in Catalonia, in the northeast Spain, where we saw that these little tiny soprano bats provided a strong pest control service to our farmers by controlling the Chilo supersalis, which is a very important pest for rice paddies. And since Madagascar is one of the most important countries in terms of rice production, rice consumption, 80% of the population survival relies on rice, we decided to go to Madagascar and try to see if we could do something similar. And also because Madagascar has about 50 bat species, many more to discover yet, and 80% of them are endemic. So all this combination of factors just make us decide to Madagascar. So in 2015, the first thing we did was travel to Ranomafana National Park. We selected 10 villages and we screened the region for potential bat colonies in buildings. So we screened everything, we did some interviews, we traveled quite a lot all the area, asking people, checking roofs, doing bat surveys all over. And we tried to saw which kind of buildings actually the bats select for roosting. And what we found is many of the largest colonies were found in this kind of buildings. So you have here a selection of the buildings that we surveyed, and many of them included churches, many of them included schools, hospitals, councils, police stations, libraries, but many of them churches as well. The common characteristic of these houses is that if you have a look from the sky, the typical villages and towns in this region of Madagascar, they were characterized by these very old traditional buildings. But we had several with these metal roofs, and this provided the perfect spot for roosting bats. So in this kind of metal, big, large buildings, we found colonies of these tiny little creatures. This is also a molluscid bat. as Niels was showing from Mexico, but different species, is a molluscid bat that flies at quite high speed, very high, but tiny compared to the ones that we have in Europe. But the thing is that they roost massively in large colonies. So as you can see here, or taking all the spaces in the buildings. We found 6 species roosting in the towns, in the villages that we look for, that we screened. But mainly the biggest colonies were formed by molluscid bats. And these colonies had more than 1,000 individuals. So suggesting that it could be a nice place to do our scientific studies, okay? So when we arrived, the question was, okay, we have the bats in the villages, in the churches, in these sacred buildings, but we want to know if they actually forage and fly over the night above the rice paddies, or they just go everywhere, anywhere else, okay? We set some ultrasound detectors in all the villages with large colonies, which are here highlighted in the map. And the results were pretty clear, as you can see here in the picture. The red bars and the greenish bars were the rice paddies, and most of the species just feed and forage over the rice paddies, as you can see in the picture. So we also did some visual observations, and they fly very close to the rice paddies, probably searching and hunting for insects. But that remained a question. So we had the bats roosting in the buildings. We had the evidence that these bats were flying on the rice, above the rice paddies. But the question is, do these bats actually consume the pests? We did some genetics, and yeah, not surprisingly, because we expected that, but it was really great news to find these 2 important rice pests in the feces of these molluscid bats. And not only these 2 species, but also another bunch of species like sugarcane cicada, macadamia nut borer, and many, of course, insects, mosquitoes, and other, insect disease vectors. So the question is, okay, we have these bats and this relation that is very clear, consuming the pests and helping farmers, but how is the relation between the villagers and the bats? So we also studied that. We did some interviews to all these inhabitants, and we found very divergent responses, or very different behaviors. For example, we got many information, so many evidence that the children actually try to hunt bats as an exercise for hunting. So practicing hunting with the tiny bats, and they play with them. But at the same time, some other people actually kill them or exclude them from the buildings because of the nuisance, like smell and noise. But instead, others, like this guy from Kalilalina, he was very proud of his colony because he could collect all the guano from the roof and then spread it over the rice paddies, and then increase the production of his fields. That was very nice. But as you can see, many divergent behaviors. So next year, the following year in 2016, we decided to go to the south west of Madagascar, another region, to see if we could find the same patterns. And we selected this region close to the Simana-Petsutsa National Park. And as you can see here, we don't have this tropical rainforest, typical rainforest from the first picture, but we got the spiny forest. In the spiny forest, we got other type of bats as well, like these Depositeros commersoni, cave-dwelling bats, or the large flying foxes. Okay, so different scenario. But we did more or less the same. We screened the area, and we found several caves that were used as sacred spaces. They have their ceremonies here, spiritual events. We got some paintings on the walls, many different cases. Okay, so we did also some interviews, and we asked people about the protection of bats in caves, and it was very interesting to find out that the customary institutions for protection were very rarely recognized by people, but instead legal protection was much more often reported by the respondents. And in terms of the use of bats, we found many evidence of bushmeat, like hunting for consumption, the use of guano, and in some cases also used for medicine. In terms of conclusions of this study, we have like evidence that although some caves were spiritual sites, 76% of the interviews did not recognize the sacred status. Therefore, legal protection was more often widely acknowledged than customary regulations, and guano extraction was often tolerated, only sometimes and always for economic compensation. We suggest that, therefore, like the erosion of customary institutions in Madagascar might happen, and we might be experiencing the loss of spiritual values in sacred sites. And just to put an example very briefly, we found out that the villages and the towns that were farther, so the more far away from national parks, they got less recognition of legal protection. Like this, in this village, they went there in the sacred spaces, in sacred caves to hunt bats, and they had very perfection techniques to hunt bats, waiting them at the emergence sites and hunting them either by fire or sticks. Okay, so that was for self-consumption, even in the same place, just near the caves, or they brought the animals back to the villagers and they celebrate the mystical meetings. They make big decisions and they share the bats with all the tribes. So different cultures. And in the same case, we got also information about tremendous exploitations of guano by some companies, because the amount of guano was huge. We found large amounts of guano in these caves, and companies like Guanomat and others, they exploit the caves for selling the guano. So they used to go to these caves, ask the locals to collect the guano for them, and then sell them in the market and even export it to Europe. Finally, I will take 1 minute more just to present like the last stage of the project. In 2018, we went back with Joan de la Maya, a professional photographer with a lot of expertise on human-wildlife conflict, to screen all Madagascar from north to south about relationships between humans and bats. And I'm gonna show you some examples about what we found in Mahaganga in the northwest. We found that bats in these places, in these caves, were either hunted by locals. That, for example, this guy Philippe was hunting bats all his life for consumption, for survival, for their family, to feed their family. He was very experienced hunting bats with his nets. But we also found lots of business in the capital, in the big cities, selling bats for tourists, like on a special meal, like this one. And we also found bats being sold in roads restaurants for locals as well, at a very cheap prices, very, very cheap compared to other meals like chicken or beef. And finally, also they captured the bats in the caves and they sold them in the markets regularly for locals. That was a very spread practice, and they cook bats at home very easily, like usually in weekends, as a party meal. So take home message of all my talk: I think that the role of sacred space to protect bats differs geographically and also from village to village. So this is a very complex situation to study. Sacred spaces might be used to protect bats, but always combined with education, just to avoid the erosion of customary institutions, as we saw in the South. Local participation is imperative and essential. I will insist on that from now and forever. So local participation is imperative for any conservation project. And as we found in several villages, education is very effective. It's very rewarding. And through education, we can just lead the country and the new young batmen to protect bats. So thank you very much. I hope I've been right with my time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrea. That was super interesting. Again, if anyone has any questions for Andrea, please pop it on the chat and we'll try to get to it at the end of the session. So on to our next panelists. I want to introduce Baharithan Murugavel, who is a PhD student from the Indian Institute of Science, Education and Research, Thiruvananthapuram. His research area is sensory ecology and behavior of fruit bats in southern India. His PhD is on understanding fruit bats' visual ecology with focus on their visual system and responses to changes in natural and artificial lighting at night. He's also the co-founder of the bat research organization, Vaval Center for Indian Bat Research on Ecosystem Sustainability, that intends to promote ecosystem sustainability in the Indian ecosystem by conducting scientific studies on bats and other related organisms. I also want to introduce Rajesh Putsawamia from the Bat Conservation India Trust. Rajesh is a lawyer by profession and works at one of the big four consulting company in Bangalore. Rajesh has also been passionate about wildlife since childhood and started observing breeding behavior of birds since an early age of 9 years old. Rajesh is also a seasoned adventurer, experienced in trekking, aqua sports, and rock climbing. He is now making use of these adventures and leadership skills for photography and conservation. So over to you guys. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you, Isis, for that nice introduction. I'll just try sharing my screen. Yeah, can you see my screen?
Yes, all good.
Okay, cool. Okay, I'll start. So thank you, Isis, for the introduction again. And I want to thank the organizers also for just taking a webinar on this interesting topic, because this is very essential for changing the negative perception of bats among the global public. So as Isis was mentioning, what me and Rajesh will be doing today is to walk you through different approaches or different associations with sacred spaces and bats across India. So to begin with, what we'll be doing today is to run you through different sites with different examples from different parts of India, and show you how diverse these perceptions across bats and sacred spaces are. So India as a nation, we know it is a nation known for its cultural and biological diversity. So there is diversity in the approaches in which different people and cultures, associate animals, bats as animals or any wildlife, or in that case, with respect to sacred spaces. So before going into my part, I'll just generally introduce what my research has been focused on. So I've been working with bats for the last 7 years, and all my research till date has been focused on this one family of non-echolocating fruit bats that is usually found to be distributed across the tropics of Asia, Africa, and Australia. So all my research till date has been focused on this one region in southern India. So most of the examples which I will be giving today are around this part of India, and Rajesh will be guiding you through the other parts later in the talk. So currently what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to understand the visual ecology of different fruit bat species in southern India, which means I study their visual system, and also I try to study their responses with respect to changes in both natural and artificial lighting, which will come back at the end of the talk. So with that introduction, before going into bats and temples as such, I'll just generally introduce the architecture of temples itself, which is very essential for making interpretations later. So India, especially the part which I'm working on, is fondly called as this land of temples just because of the sheer number of rock temples which is present here. At the present day, we have more than 30,000 rock temples dating from 500 to greater than 1,000 years old. And not all rocky temples are found to be having this mega tower-like mega structures. So the temples here come in different sizes and shapes. So in the top here, you can see one temple which is present at the middle of the city, and the city itself is built around this temple. So there are these examples of such mega temples which forms the heart of cities. But there are also examples of certain other temples, like the one which is seen in the bottom. It is like a guardian angel temple, often found in many villages across India. So these do not exactly have iconic rocky structures or any mega structures as such, but they are also often associated with natural elements, and they have a large space, but structurally it's not that complex as the mega structures. And these are often present at the outskirts of the temple, and these are guardian angel temples, which means these temples are kind of the protectors of the village. So they are present at the border. or a small village temple at the bottom. Most of these temples are having a general scheme in which this has been built. So this architectural scheme has been followed consistently for many years, and even the new temples which are constructed today kind of follows the general scheme similarly. And intuitively, if you think about bats roosting in these mega structures, one would always think it is this large hollow towers will be the ideal places for roosting or bats living, which is not true all the case. So most of the cases, if you just take a stroll in a temple which hosts bats in southern India, you can find bats hanging out in all different parts of this temple. Each of this segment in this temple has its own spiritual and architectural significance, and bats are not necessarily restricted to just these towers. So what is important here is this temple, like the campus itself, the whole temple campus offers ideal roosting locations for these animals, and uh, they're they're serving as ideal roosting grounds for many of the rock dwelling species. So not necessarily the towers, but the whole campus, the whole structure is ideal roosting grounds for many of the rock dwelling species. But the story does not end here. So, what is interesting here is when we speak about temples, especially in a country like India, it is not just the structure or it's not just the worship which is important there. There is a whole lot of ecosystem which is built across these whole temples, and that is eventually having positive and negative impacts on the ecology of the animals there. So, here I just want to introduce this case study, which was interestingly one of my first ever experiences to study bats in a southern Indian temple from southern India in Madurai. So what this study has documented is, so when this is a mega temple present at the in a base of an hillock, and what this temple has is it itself has a large colony of bats roosting inside. But this story is not about the bats which are roosting inside, but it's about the bats which are foraging outside. So when I said a whole ecosystem is built around these temples, I meant there is a large economy which is built around the temples by terms of these shops in which people sell religious merchandise, fruits, flowers as offerings for the deity inside. And these shops are often raided by this macaques in the day. So what these shopkeepers do here is they try to feed these animals by hand just to prevent them raiding their shops. That is happening in the daytime. But interestingly, these animals, these macaques never completely consume these offerings, and they just eat partially and just leave these remains on the roofs for the night. This partially consumed fruit remains of the night becomes ideal foraging grounds for this little fruit bat, which is shown in the circle. So these fruit bats, this study has documented this exact interaction where this fruit bats just find this partially consumed fruits of the macaques as a potential foraging ground. So it is becoming an opportunistic foraging ground now, and these animals have been consistently visiting these temples, and they are consistently consuming these remains across the year. So this what happens here is the temple ecosystem as such has now provided an opportunistic feeding opportunity for these animals here. And what happened later is it has been extended to even the fruit shops in the arena. So this is a common sight if one can notice in the shops near the same temple where shopkeepers try to cover their banana bunches when they are ripe just to prevent fruit bats from feeding on them. So what happened here is this whole temple ecosystem has now created an opportunistic feeding ground for these animals, which would have otherwise fed on natural resources. So, temples both serve as roosting and opportunistic feeding grounds for these animals in India. But again, so till now we are talking about the ecology and feeding patterns of these animals. But what happens when belief system kicks in? So here I have a news article from a local newspaper from the local language here. So what happens here is this is again small village temple. So it is not having any mega structure. But if you see in the picture which is in the rightmost, so that is the main shrine within which bats roost. So what happens here is whenever what people believe here is that whenever somebody goes and prays to this deity, and if they see a bat which is flying out of that, they think the deity has listened or accepted their offerings and wishes. So what they see here is like according to these people, bats are considered as a connection between them and the divine. So they consider bat as a divine connect, and this connection is not just restricted to bats, but it is also extending to different wildlife which is present inside the temple. However, this whole system kind of preserves the habitat, and it also has very much conservation benefits, and this is a belief system which drives this whole interesting interaction here. So next, till now I was just introducing about rock temples and bats roosting within or foraging around rock temples, but not all bats are rock dwelling bats, and not all temples are also rock based temples. So when you come to India, you can always notice this large flying fox flying out in the evening. So that is like an iconic bat which anybody can notice in India. And these are not rock dwelling species. They are preferred. They are known to roost in daytime and large colonies and open trees. So sacred associations are more prominent in these species also. So if you see in the bottom picture, this is a small construction which is actually the place of worship. But the whole space together for a perimeter which includes trees and semi-forested area, together it is considered as a sacred grove, which means this whole area is a sacred space which does not have any much of mega structures, but within which there is a large colony of flying foxes roosting. So this whole system now preserves not just the animal but also the whole ecosystem. What happens here is people do not let humans to go inside or even take fruits from these places. They just leave it for wildlife and bats. So this whole system based on conservation, based on sacredness, conserves many species. And as Niels was mentioning earlier, we also have these cave temples here. So here you can see a picture of a large colony of Smede's leaf-nosed bat happily hanging in the presence of the priest. So this is also in southern India, Tamil Nadu. So what is interesting here is like these animals have been habituated with these worships and all these practices for many years, and they don't get easily disturbed at certain sites. And this whole belief system coupled with worshipping and all this thing completely preserves not just the habitat for the animals but also for humans. So already this sacredness and all these associations add a layer of conservation, and when belief system comes into the picture, it brings into a second layer of conservation which is very useful for the whole ecosystem, not just these bats. So I think by now you must have understood why the flying foxes are conserved together as a when you conserve a flying fox roost, you together conserve a whole area around it. So for these flying foxes are often referred as sacred flying foxes in scientific literature, and this documentation of sacred flying foxes has been happening for at least 3 decades. So in southern India, this documentation has been there for more than 30 years for now. But actually, if you think about, if you go and ask in the villages, we don't know the exact origin. So most of these whole tree-based roosting sacred spaces where flying foxes are often associated are guardian angel temples or ancestral worship temples. So as Niels was mentioning earlier, we could not exactly find out when actually this whole association started. So there have been examples where bats came to these temples after the temples were established. There are also examples where people could not exactly find out which happened first. So this has been very long. So this has been centuries old, maybe. So but scientifically we know it at least decades old. So this decade old, century old associations are having so much benefits when it comes to conservation. And this is not restricted just to Tamil Nadu, especially the sacred flying fox thing. It's been present in many examples across the country, which Rajesh will be touching upon sooner. So what I want to give as a message here is that we give different roles to bats here in India just because of the sacredness. And so if you read about these examples, you can find bats are having multiple roles like protectors of villages, bringers of wealth, sometimes punishers. They also are acting as sign of prosperity and wealth, predictors of natural calamity and whatnot. So bats are having multiple roles, and that is how people see these animals here. So okay, till now we have been talking about these sacred associations and how they're useful for bats. Like, what is the actual take home from all these associations? So whenever we think about such conservation, it is having direct translation to active conservation. Even though these people are not trained to be conservationists or they don't have any background to understand conservation, all these belief systems eventually end up in conserving the whole habitat. So this century long, year long association was very useful in the last year when there was this pandemic. So when there was a wave of negativity and a bad impression of bats across media, there were also cases where people went and interviewed all these villages. Unanimously across the country, all the villages which had bats roosting in them, they all agreed that bats roosting in them was a sacred space and it is not just an Indian thing. So what we know recently is that there is a large number of examples across cultures throughout Asia Pacific where bats have been either portrayed neutral or positive elements, not necessarily negative all the case. There have been so many folklores, so many short stories, and so many cultural perceptions across the Asian Pacific. Not all are like negatively portrayed. So that is something which I wanted to. Due to time, I'm not going into all the examples across the Asian Pacific. But what I want to tell you here is that these associations are not just restricted to one or two places. It is there all over the place, and I think that is something which is which should be a take home from my talk here. So for interested people, you can always go and try reading this open access review which was out earlier. So I was also a part of this study where we have delved deep into different cultural associations across the Asian Pacific cultures, and we have given a list of how bats have been portrayed in different cultures and the different examples there. So if people are interested, you can just go and try reading this open access study online. So to before with that, I am concluding my part, and before passing it on to Rajesh, I just want to list out this interesting 2,000-year-old literature poem. Like what Niels was mentioning, Mayans were documenting these animals long back. We also have this year-old uh, literature pieces, which is called as Sangam literature in southern India. We have poetry, which has been dated for these years, and there are so many associations of many animals and of course bats. So here is an example where a bat uh, emergence of a bat is being portrayed in a poem which actually has a theme of love. So again here there have been many examples like this, and none of these examples are portraying bad in a bad light. It is either a neutral light or in a good light. So we also have this year-old associations here. So I think with that I can pass it on to Rajesh. Yeah.
Thanks, Bhairatan. I hope all of you can hear me. Yeah. Can you just share the slides? Isis, can you just shift the control to me? Or hold on, I'll probably share the slide myself. Okay. Okay, good everyone. Thanks, Bhairatan, for setting the context and how things, how bats are viewed across India, especially the southern part of India. What I would do now is give you an overview in terms of how bats are perceived across different parts of India, and how is the difference in terms of whether the positivity and negativity, or in unique ways in each of the jurisdictions or areas of India, how bats exactly are protected or kind of decimated. So with that, I'll just take you to start with the place where Bhairatan started. It's a temple in southern India in Madurai. He talked about bats coming outside of the temple, though there was bats roosting in. Here we have an example of a fulvous fruit bat, which are roosting almost about 5,000 bats roosting in the temple itself, in the temple premises, where the people walk around, the pilgrims walk around, but there's no disturbance caused to bats as such. So if you can make out from the darker markings of the roof, clearly indication that these bats have been roosting, because these are the urine marks. And the temple authorities as well as the pilgrims are well aware about the bats roosting here, and they've been coexisting with humans in these temples for a long time. Moving up a little bit to the west of Madurai temple, we have other temples which are again probably hundreds of years old, if not thousands of years old. In these temples, we have black bear tombats, which are commonly found, and different species occupy different temple structures across. So what is interesting is, since these are all stone or the granite based temples, they literally act as alternate roosting sites for the bats, because most natural cave ecosystem could have been damaged, and temple structures which provide ambient temperature and safety for these bats, I mean, they definitely get protected through protection from natural predators as snakes or birds trying to kind of attack them. So these sacred places are definitely an alternate roost for bats. As Niels also mentioned and Bhairath mentioned, cave temples are pretty common across Southeast Asia, and which is common in rest of the India as well. So this is one such subterranean cave temple in a place called Kamaleshili on the western part of India in the Western Ghats. This is a temple which is hosting snake, basically a snake deity, and pilgrims do visit this cave on a regular basis. So we can see the bats moving out of the cave, emerging out of the cave, and you can also notice different species of bats roosting on the roof of the cave. So this is again a common cave across western parts of India, and in some places. What's nice about the priests and the people visiting these caves is they really don't harm bats, though there are some of them who might be concerned about safety and have more insight in terms of the myths and have heard about the myths. But the fortunate thing is we have seen the priests kind of manage those perceptions of people and then educate them about that bats are not really a threat to the human beings, and they've been living here in this case for years together, generations together, and not to be worried. In especially in this cave, what I noticed is the priest who can see who's explaining. Every time he brings people, he makes them switch off their mobile phones, torches, everything, and makes them experience the darkness, and gives them example of how bats can roost in a dark environment and how they can navigate within dark environment. The interesting aspect is the priest is not trained. He is or basically whatever he has learned is through his own experience and knowledge, rather than through any formal education. So culturally, some of these places are well known. People do live in harmony with bats and do revere and support the conservation of those species. Uh, Similarly, we have other cave temple called Yana. It's a megalithic structure, bit of north of Western Ghats and part of central Western Ghats. And we have again different species of bats roosting in different cave structures here in this temple as well. So this is again a cave temple which is frequented by thousands of people every day, and people pass through the temple structure as well as the caverns in this, and almost every person who goes there either for hiking or for pilgrimage do experience bats, and they are kind of protected in so apart from cave temple, there are, as Bhairath mentioned, southern India has more than 30,000 temples in just that small, the southern state of Tamil Nadu. Similarly, Karnataka also has similar kind of structures, huge complex structures of temples. And there's one place called Hampi, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, has multiple temples. Of course, some of them are now ruins and not really an active temple where there's a deity is would call puja is performed, but there are some temples which are still active and where there's a process going on and also still hosts bats. For example, this Virupaksha temple in Hampi hosts leaf-nosed bats as tomb bats. Very evidently present in most of the structures. Again, they're found in the main sanctum sanctorum as well as the other chambers across the temple structures. We do find tomb bats also within the rock crevices within the temple crevices. So we talk about bats in sacred places, not just the temples of South India, but also the temples or the mosque and other sacred places also host bats. Of course, I'm not covering the church aspect, but there are a couple of mosques even in South India as well as in Central India and North Indian region where bats have been occupying the dome of this the mosque. I mean, again, here they're quite protected, and the only risk that they have is usually if there's any refurbishing done or the repainting done to the structure, they are chased out. Any active mosques are still kind of considerate enough to protect these bats and not really chased out. However, there are a few examples. For example, the bats that you see in the right-hand side here were found in another mosque, which where there's no prayer done, but unfortunately that particular mosque structure is used for kind of black magic. So in some sort, there is a negative perception about bats as well, and they consider those places as a evident for propagating black magic, and if, there's a negative perception to that as well. However, moving more towards eastern part of India, there are different examples of, again, bats roosting in old temple structures, and the concerns of bats being decimated, the numbers are reducing. The temple authorities are taking cognizance of that and trying to figure out, is it the lighting that has been added is impacting the bats, or if it's a renovation that's impacting the bat. So a good example of taking cognizance of trying to live in harmony with bats, and also taking steps to kind of measure that. So we definitely are seeing positive messages and positive news from a couple of communities. We have similar experience in Bihar, where a village called Sasai has a tree roost. Basically, the flying foxes, the pteropus bats are completely protected, and there's a common belief across most of these villages. What Bhairadan mentioned, the sacred groves, what we call as sacred groves, is a what we call as a village forest area dedicated for each of the villages or the cluster of villages. In these sacred groves, not just the bats but all wildlife is protected, and sometimes bats act as a flagship species and also drive people to kind of protect that particular area. So that we can see across different parts, like say Assam, northeast of Assam. Then we have in Andhra Pradesh as well, some places in Andhra Pradesh. One common thing we have heard across the Indian landscape is that villagers who are living in harmony with bats do believe that if there are bats roosting in near their village, it basically helps them protect any potential pandemic, and not really the other way around. Unfortunately, we see more negative perception. But I would like to end with this note here. While bats are found in most of the sacred places, we have bats in the sacred caves. Northeast India is home to number of caves, and we have huge population of tribal folks here in the northeast, and many of these places are community conservation reserves. They are not really government owned, and the community basically protects most of the wildlife and the environment around it. The uniqueness about this place is there's a place called Mimi, which is bordering India and Myanmar, and every year there's a practice followed by a community called Yumchingur. Yumchingur is basically a tribe, and within that Yumchingur tribe, there is a clan called Bomma clan. So these Bomma clan members are spread between Myanmar and India, and every year during October, just the end of monsoon, they all congregate and go for a harvest. So there are one or two cases where this annual harvest happen. Um, so for them, this is a spiritual aspect, because these bats roost in the sacred caves where sometimes their ancestors might be buried, or they might be placed after their death. And the belief is that only if they harvest these bats every year and consume them, they would be accepted in heaven by their ancestors. So that's one of the spiritual belief that they have. Hence, it's quite challenging to kind of pass on a conservation message while trying to kind of address the community beliefs as well. So we have different perspectives in different regions of India. Again, while it's a sacred place, but may not necessarily be a positive outcome. And there is a strong need to kind of have a dialogue with the community and then see if these practices can be regulated, if not completely stopped. With that, I just want to kind of pass on few messages in overall observation. What we see is spiritually, ecology is a important topic, and the conservation aspect where bats are definitely considered as an important play in the ecosystem and are protected by different communities across. The challenge that we see is not from the village community, but primarily from the urban community, where people, I would say, more half educated, or believer more from the what do you call myths than practicality. And we have seen examples of trees being chopped, smoke being used to kind of chase the bats, or chemicals being sprayed to kill the bats and chased out. Especially during the pandemic, we have seen more such examples coming from the urban environment rather than from the rural environment. So it's quite important to kind of educate the urban community as well, while the rural community is much more inclined to live in harmony with the bats. With that, I'll just want to pass on back to Bayrathan to add a couple of more points and share this ending comments. Bayrathan, over to you.
Yeah, so the final take home, like what Rajesh was mentioning, the misconception is are being a standing threat in the urban public. So even though we have this year-old associations with among the rural public, so mostly these misconceived notions, especially based on the social media and media influence, like we have differences of opinion across different groups of people in the country. And yeah, urbanization is becoming a great threat. So because I think I know some examples where people were trying to seal all these hollow towers in the temples or any monuments just to give stability for these structures. However, if that is going to happen, it is going to have greater impacts on these animals and it will backfire on us at the end. So one another interesting but less exposed issue is the impact of artificial lighting. So we are a country which has more than 120 bat species. Most of them are associated with human habitations. They are city dwelling. They are considered urban bat species, and light pollution is something which is increasing rapidly every year. And we are just trying to understand this issue at a very basic level now. We're just beginning to explore this aspect in India, and we have a long way to go. But so that is one crucial thing which is been affecting animals across the world, and we are just trying to understand this aspect in India now. So that, in my opinion, I think that needs more investigation in the future. But anyways, finally, as Rajesh was also mentioning, it is not we can't generalize any conclusion now. So it is a complex system, and we have both positives and negatives. But what could be a positive take home here is there are already these existing belief systems which are conserving these animals for a long time. So what I would suggest is to consider these belief systems just because they have mass following, and any outreach could be reaching many people just because of this belief system. So in certain spaces where there is a pre-existing belief system, one can design conservation plans just making use of the existing positives there instead of going and starting from the scratch. So that is when the whole concept of spiritual ecology becomes very important and crucial for a country like India. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Bayrathan. Go to SS.
Thanks, guys. That was super interesting. We have run over slightly over the time, so I just want to quickly move on to the Q&A section of this webinar. So first, there's a question for Nils from Rotted. Says, Nils, when you say Mayan illustrated bats, what sort of depictions were these, positive versus negative? And how many species could you distinctly recognize in these depictions?
Sorry, Isis, can you come again with the question? I couldn't hear clearly.
Yes, this was a question for Nils. I just want to make sure he's still present. Is he still present?
I don't see him.
No, I think we can move on, and we'll ask him after the after this session.
Okay, lovely. Cool. Well, I'll move on to the next question. And this question is for Andrea, and it's from Emma. So, Andrea, would you consider? Wait, let me make sure that's the correct question. Yes, Andrea, would you consider doing some research in the islands near Madagascar, Reunion Islands in particular? I know they have some endemic bats and was wondering if they occupy local churches. There is also a lot of sugarcane fields in Reunion. Do you reckon bats would hunt in these areas? Thank you.
Okay, so hi, Emma. Yeah, I would definitely consider going there and do some studies, for sure. In fact, I've been working lately with some colleagues in the Mauritius Islands, which is not La Reunion, but it's very close. And we found like one of those endemic species hunting some pest species over the sugarcanes and agricultural lands. So on a way, we are trying to do that. So we're doing this in Mauritius, but we would be glad to expand in other islands. And islands are, for bats, especially interesting in terms of endemic species, which also always deserve a lot of attention for conservation. So yeah, thank you for the question.
Thank you for the answer, Andrea. This is a question from Lily. There's already a good dialogue going on in the chat, but I thought it'd be great to invite the panelists to answer. So it's a question for all of you. Have you experienced any pushback from locals when using these sacred spaces for your research, especially if these sacred spaces are still actively used for spiritual religious purposes?
Okay, maybe I'll take this one first and others could add. So yes, that is one interesting thing which often
Sorry, we can't hear
in these
you.
sites, especially in India, at least, but it is in a let any people go and can you hear me?
Yeah, all good now, thank you.
Yeah, so yeah, I'll just try to give my perspective here. So at least in my experience, yes, there has been some level of pushback like from the locals, just because they have associated these spaces just more than these for these animals. So what happens is like it is interesting sometimes because once you explain that we are also trying to do good for these animals and we try to explain what we are going to do exactly, sometimes they understand this, and if we are for bats, then the pushback gets reduced. So but they're very conscious about these things, at least in some spaces in India. So they don't just let any people go and study these animals. So you need to have a dialogue, and you should explain this, what is exactly happening, and once they are convinced, yes. So I feel it like it's even a more layer of protection for these animals. So I find it a good thing. Yeah.
I can add something here if it's okay. So in terms of behavior from locals when I arrived to these places, I wanted to say that on the talk, but I didn't have the time. But usually I want to highlight the fact that in many cases we are like a bunch of white strangers going to these places, and it makes no sense to expect like an open response from everyone. So in all the time, so we need time, we need dedication, and we need to build strong relationship and friendship with people, because we need to build trust. We need to explain like properly what we are doing, what would be the consequences of what we are doing, what would be the impact for them. I mean, we should never expect like, okay, I arrived to this village and I want to go into their sacred caves and I want them to open me the door. So this is a very Western society mindset, and we need to change that, and we need to be very careful that we are actually going to other countries with other cultures, and we try, at least always try to first meet the people, explain things, and spend time. So scientific results cannot come like that. Boom, you got it. You need time, you need to go, you need to talk, and you need them to understand what we want. And we might be wrong, so we might change our mindset and our scientific design and everything. So we need to be open-minded to change things. It's rather what they think, but what we propose. I don't know if I explain myself like clear, but that's our philosophy.
No, that was great. Thank you so much. And we have what can I invite any Rajesh? Do you have any invite to say anything, or would you like me to move on to the next question?
Nothing. I think we can move to the next question.
Okay, sweet. We have quite a lot of questions for all the panelists in the chat, but because of time, I'm only going to ask one other last question. And this question is from Rotit for Barathiran. And he says, I was quite intrigued in the ethnology study map. India was depicted by goddess Kali, who is associated with anger and rage. Could you briefly tell us the connection between bats and Kali?
Oh, yeah. So the example which I was showing there, the published work itself was on a Kali temple. So yes, as Rohit was mentioning, it is she is a goddess associated with anger. Those perceptions extend to this conservation also. So not just in that temple. So as I said, these are our guardian angels. So that exact example is a Kali who's protecting her forest. So it's called as Madhikata Kali, which means it's a Kali for that forest. So often not just restricted to Kali, there is this whole fear which is also there among people. So they fear the rage of these deities if they disturb these animals or go and try to encroach their territory or something. So often there are also been examples where people fear that if something bad will happen to them or their business or anything, if they intentionally do something bad to it. So yes, that rage is also used for conservation there. So not necessarily the Kali one. Yeah, that example was from Kali, but mostly it is associated with these kind of beliefs. Yeah. So they don't they also try to conserve these animals out of this whole belief system, which is driven by fear also. Sometimes, yeah.
Great. Thank you so much. That was super interesting. And yeah, to wrap up, I want to thank you for joining us today. A huge thank you to all our speakers, the National Lottery Heritage Fund and the British Ecological Society. This session has been recorded and will be available to watch again from the events page of the Bats and Churches website in the next few days, where you can also find the rundown of all the upcoming events. After you finish, you'll see a very short feedback survey to help us plan future events. Please do fill it out if you have a minute to spare. Thank you again to everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.